We're just recording this so that if anyone wants to have a listen later on or pass it on to anyone who's not here. I'll start off by just giving you a bit of background. I've started working after bushfires when I was part of a children's hospital team working in the Masson area after Ash Wednesday. And as a part of a hospital service, we visited that community for 4 years after the event, which gave us a chance to watch the whole recovery cycle unfolding with that community. 2 years into that, there was another fire in a neighbouring area around the Victorian town of Maryborough. And so at one stage I was visiting two communities that were 2 years apart in their recovery process. I started to see certain common themes, certain issues repeating. And one thing led to another, and what was clear was that nobody quite knew what people needed. And what we realised was most people actually recover pretty well in the long run, but it's quite a long, hard road for many people. And we realised that the better people understand what's going on, the better that they can take care of themselves. And what I wanted to talk to you about is some of the things I've learned from working with different communities. I live in a community that was surrounded by fire on Black Saturday, and possibly I wouldn't be here if the wind hadn't changed, because none of us really understood what was coming at that time. It's been very important to me to see how the communities have gradually recovered and what some of the long-term effects have been. And we've just had the 10th anniversary last year, and my wife actually had someone contact her the other day and say she has just managed to rebuild her house, and she wants to, there's a friend of my wife's wants her to come and have a look at it. So that, you know, for some people the rebuilding process is a long, hard process. But what I want to share with you is just a few things about perhaps the place you're at now. What is it, 6 weeks since the event? There's been a tremendous amount of activity, starting off with the fire itself. I've been hearing about how dangerous and threatening it was, how sudden. You had various fires coming and going at different points, but at various points they took everyone by surprise. And that then starts off a whole process where everybody's racing around trying to deal with things, and then in the aftermath trying to work out where you're going to live and what you're going to do and how you're going to deal with things and helping other people out. And that starts to settle maybe around about now as people find accommodation and the grass starts to grow a bit and everything starts to settle. But this is sort of transition from all the turmoil to then looking forward and saying, where do we head? What have we got to do? We've got a huge job ahead of us. And I want to explain a little bit about the way adrenaline works, because that's the chemistry that puts us into survival mode when there's a threat. And I think it's really important to understand adrenaline, because adrenaline is empowering. It really makes us able to do incredible amounts of work, but at a certain cost. And adrenaline is suitable for dealing with an immediate physical threat. So what adrenaline does is it's activated by this, I perceive a threat that I must deal with now or things are going to get worse. So I don't have a choice, I just go into that adrenaline mode. And what adrenaline does is it floods your system with stored energy that's tucked away. Eating good food like this tucks away the energy in in little deposits in your body, and it's there to call on. Normally you don't call on, but when the adrenaline goes, it's just flooded. And it empowers you because what it does is shut down the feedback system. So when a sudden emergency happens, you don't ask, can I do this? You simply ask, what do I need to do? I've been telling the story of the smallish middle-aged woman that was on a training with me, and when we talked about adrenaline, she told the story of she was there with her 10-year-old son, who was about as big as her, picking mushrooms in a paddock, which had a little bit of a hill on it. And suddenly a bull came charging up over the hill with its horns down. She didn't realise it was in the paddock. And she said she didn't actually even think. She simply took a step towards her son and threw him over the fence and jumped over after him. Now, normally, she said she wouldn't be able to lift him. Another woman described to me the story of driving down to her holiday house with her family, and a bushfire started. They'd brought a brand new generator, and with difficulty, she and her husband lifted it out of the back of the ute or the station wagon, put it in the carport. They didn't get time to do anything with it, and this fire came. So her husband goes off with other men to fight the fire, and she's going to evacuate. She puts all the kids and stuff in the car, and she's about to back out, and she sees the generator and says, well, I don't want to leave that to be burnt. So she picks it up and puts it in the station wagon and drives home. When she gets home, she can't lift it. She has to wait for about 3 days until her husband comes home, and they lift it out with difficulty again. See, so many people will tell you these stories. Do you ever hear the stories about old grannies that lift tractors off their sons or something? You know, this is adrenaline, and the more dangerous and extreme the situation, the more powerful that adrenaline kick is. And what adrenaline does in our brains is specialise us in the right side of our brain where we think in pictures, because dealing with a physical problem is about thinking in pictures. You know, where's the fire? What do I have to do? How far is it? How big is it? Etc. And it's a very quick and dirty kind of way of solving the problem. And it shuts down the feedback because you don't feel tired. Do you notice you don't feel tired when you're on adrenaline? You just go and go and go. And you don't feel hungry. You don't feel thirsty. In fact, I have a friend who fought the fire on Black Saturday, managed to save his house, and he said the strange thing is that it didn't even feel hot. Because he was too focused on what had to be done. So now the thing is that what the adrenaline response will do will be shut down and give you this tremendous sense of going, going, going. But there's a risk because people will go and go and then suddenly they'll collapse. Normally the feedback is saying, I'm getting tired, I'm getting very tired, I'm getting extremely tired, I really need to take a break. Or I'm getting hungry, I'm getting thirsty, or whatever. But the adrenaline will shut it down until something goes wrong and gives. And when a person gets to that state of exhaustion with adrenaline, they usually just suddenly collapse. Well, they don't necessarily physically collapse, but they just get to the point where I just can't do anything anymore, I'm just absolutely spent. And I think that's a bad state because then people are so depleted, they don't bounce back very easily. It takes them a long time if they get very exhausted to bounce back. And what also goes with that is that you lose the energy that's required to manage emotions. So suddenly people get these feelings of absolute despair and feeling overwhelmed. So you get this kind of emotional collapse, physical collapse and so on. And so if people then sort of recuperate a bit, and then the risk is they go straight back into adrenaline mode and go like hell until they have another setback which actually causes this sort of downer. And so you get this kind of up and down state which creates instability. And that becomes very disturbing because people feel, what's wrong with me? What's happening to me? But it's very predictable because you're not using the feedback because you've shut it down. Actually, when the adrenaline kicks in, it also produces other chemicals called endorphins that go to the pain receptors in our body and bond to them and shut them down. you get this anaesthetic effect. You know, you can run around on a football field out there and get clobbered numerous times, and you don't feel it until you're having a shower afterwards. You think, geez, where did I get hurt there? Because the adrenaline of the game shuts down the feedback system. And so people can not really understand what they need. Now, I'm giving very simple examples, and probably people just keep going through a period of fire. But the important thing to recognise, I think, is that people are not making good decisions about themselves, because in the adrenaline state you come narrowed and focused on what you think is the important problem. You know, psychologists run experiments with people, and they have a big display of lights, and they have to press this button if this display happens, and that button if that pattern happens, and so on. And then they ramp up the stress and the pressure by saying, you've got to do it faster and faster and faster. And by the way, we'll give you lots of money if you get it right. So, you know, people get really revved up and excited, like playing the pokies, you know. That's an adrenaline kick, isn't it? I don't know, I've never done it. But now, what they notice is that when you ramp up the pressure, people become narrower and narrower in their focus, and they start to ignore the parts of the display that aren't immediately in front of them. Whereas in actual fact, that's really important information. If they're going to get their $10 reward, they've got to look at the whole picture. But they don't, they narrow in. And now this is fine if you're dealing with a charging bull or a fire, you just need to focus on that element. But I think the same thing happens with people's lives. And what you see is that people narrow in and focus on the most obvious, clear-cut problem they've got, which probably translates into physical problems, fences, houses, whatever, and don't look at themselves, don't look at their relationships, don't look at their health, and this can set up a pattern, a lifestyle. Now, I was talking with somebody from one of the Victorian communities who lost her house around about the same time, probably it was New Year's Eve, I think, where she lost her house. And she's been rushing around getting things organised, and she's just in this same process of starting to settle. And she describes a whole lot of emotions coming and going, ups and downs, anger, sadness, regret, questions, why didn't I do this, acceptance, but then going through it all again, this turmoil. Because she's coming out of the adrenaline, and now she starts to feel, because the adrenaline shuts the feelings down. And she says, you know, people come up to her and they put their arm around her and say, oh, how are you going? And she doesn't want to have her emotions stirred up by people being sympathetic. Other people make jokes about it, and that really upsets her too. They make light of it. Other people ignore it. That upsets her. A woman told me in another fire in Victoria that she lost her house, and she would go and do the shopping. And then at the supermarket, she'd come to the checkout where there's some girl that she's known all her life, and the girl would sympathetically say, oh, how are you, Mrs. Smith? It must be so hard. You've lost your house. She said, why can't she just treat me like a normal person for once? Why can't I go and do the shopping without someone reminding me I've lost my house? And a bit later in that session I had, I saw another woman who said, I go down to the supermarket, and this kid I've known since she was a little kid just says, hi, Mrs. Jones, how are you? Doesn't she realise I've lost my house and my whole life's been turned upside down? Why can't she recognise, you know? And it's like there's a period of sensitivity which means that whatever you get, it doesn't feel right. Now, I say that it's as though everybody has lost their skin, you know, and everything becomes incredibly sensitive. You know, when you've got 7 layers of cells, haven't you? And the outer 2 layers are dead. And they provide a bit of insulation so that a touch is just a touch. But if you scrape them off and then you touch, it's too raw and sensitive and too hurtful. And I think people often get into these periods. Now, maybe the community won't do it all together. People will have it at different times where they have this feeling of being skinless. I think it's a really important thing for people to understand that, you know, Rob's lost his skin today, don't talk to him. Or maybe you need to be very warm and sympathetic, but how would you know? You'd have to check it out, wouldn't you? And maybe tonight I want you to be sympathetic, tomorrow I want you to treat me as a normal person. So this whole period of time, I think it's really important that everyone is sort of aware that everyone's going through their own process. And if we just think about this adrenaline process and the sensitivity of this, what it often does is create an environment where people feel, I don't know, I want to pull back, I want to hold back, I want to sort of try and re-establish. What creates that skin is, I think, having routines, having things that we don't need to think about. Like I know where all the pots and pans are, and where I keep my toothbrush and the socks and all the rest of it. And I've got a routine in my daily life. When we're not in routine, we have to work everything out. It's very exhausting. And so it's really only as we start to build a routine that we get this sense of a kind of a bit of a buffer. So at this point, I think it's really important to see that there is a whole path ahead as we move from this surviving the moment to looking at the long term. And what I notice is that if people are not thoughtful, they will go straight into, from this adrenaline state, totally focused on the most obvious problem that I've got. They will then shift into, what do I have to do to solve that problem? Now, if you do that, what you get is a person going from acute stress, which is I've got a huge problem, I must do something about it, to continuing stress. I've got a huge problem, but there's nothing I can do about it now, except just keep working and do it day after day after day until it's all finished. And the risk is that everything else gets dropped out. So what gets dropped out? You know, probably everybody's life was full up before the fire came, full up with your activities. There was no room much for anything else. And now you've got a huge amount of additional work to do. What are you going to drop out? Well, the risk is that what you drop out is rest, recreation, enjoyment, social life, playing with the kids, going for holidays, and your life, because the feeling can be, we haven't got time for that nonsense, don't you realise we've got to do this, that and the other? And so people move into a state of chronic work. I tell this story about the guy who lost his house in Ash Wednesday. He built it himself, and he was poking around amongst the ruins a few days later, and his neighbour, who had also lost his house, came over and they commiserated together, and the neighbour said, what are you going to do? And he said, I'm going to rebuild. And so the neighbour said, oh, I'll help you. So for the next 6 months, he spent every waking minute he wasn't earning his living building his house with his neighbour. At 6 months, he moved back in. It was pretty good. Then the neighbour said, I'm going to start mine now. Now, he felt absolutely exhausted, but he felt obliged to help his neighbour, as you would, wouldn't you? So he spent 6 months helping his neighbour. 3 years later, he's divorced. They've sold everything. He's living in a flat near the airport, and he sees his kids every second weekend. And because I had a bit of contact with him early on, he looked me up in the phone book 5 years later and came along and said, I don't understand what happened to my life. Now, what happened to his life was, of course, he didn't actually focus on his marriage. And marriages need maintenance. I don't know what it's like for you guys in Kangaroo Island, but I notice in Victoria, I've got to be nice to my wife nearly every day. And if you don't, over time it will change. And he didn't put any energy into it. And so he thought he had a good marriage beforehand, but he took it for granted. Now, other people will tell you they didn't take care of their health or diet, and so when they come out, maybe a year or two later, they've had a deterioration in their health. There are people who say they no longer feel close to their kids because they didn't focus on their kids for maybe a year or two. Now, a year or two is not long for an adult. Nothing much happens in our lives in a year or two. But for a kid, going from 3 to 5 or 13 to 15, it's a huge lot of development happens during that time. And if the family's not available, things change. And I think these are the things to be aware of. Most people will start to pick these things up, but I suppose my message is this is really what's important, because what determines how a person comes out of this disaster in 10 years' time, can you look back and say, well, that was a horrible year, but we're okay now. We're all together. We've got a good life. It's not the same life, but it's a good life. Or, like this guy, say, I don't know what happened, I lost everything. Not just my house, but my marriage and health and so on. So they're unnecessary losses, aren't they? You can't do anything about the house. But the other things you can actually put time and investment into. And I suppose that's really my message from working with a lot of communities and hearing people tell stories looking back at what they didn't put their focus on. And that's what adrenaline will do. It will put your focus out into the world on physical stuff. But what determines the real outcome is not the physical stuff, but the quality of life. Now, when I started working in disasters, there was a big argument amongst the researchers. Are there mental health problems after disasters or not? And researchers would go out and do surveys and they'd find actually mental illness doesn't increase after disasters. If you've already got depression, you feel worse. But people don't necessarily go into profound depression. But the people who were working in the community said, no, people really do it tough. They suffer a lot. They feel very distressed. And so there's a big argument. And actually, I think it's a mistake to be putting it in terms of mental health. What we need to do is put it in terms of distress. If any of us have a hard enough time for long enough and we get tired and we feel worried about the future and we can't see our way through it, we're going to get really upset and we're going to feel really bad. And that's where we have to see that to be involved in these kind of activities, to be in the community where people help each other, to know that actually everyone's doing it tough and we all talk to each other. We don't try and pretend that I'm all right. In fact, some of the researchers have invented a name for this process where you look around at your neighbours and they all look as though they're standing tall and doing it all right, but I feel terrible. And so I feel it must be me. Everyone's doing it all right, but I feel terrible. I must be weak. But actually, if you talk to the next person, they'll say, yeah, I feel terrible, but he's all right. So I must be weak, and so on, right round the community. And nobody feels able to put their hand up. What I've been hearing today, there's a lot of good communication in this community that is going to work against that sort of process. But that tendency towards isolation means that the distress builds up and builds up in people's lives. And I don't think they get a mental illness, but I had to give it a name. I think they suffer from what I call degraded quality of life. Quality of life. Those features of life that make it enjoyable, meaningful, valuable, and give us a sense of what we're on about. And that's the thing I think is so important to look out for, because it will take probably, for most people, a year or 2 or 3 to be out the other side. So you're going to run a marathon, not a 200 metres hurdles. And how do you do a marathon? You train and set a pace that you can maintain through the race, don't you? If you run as fast as you can for a little while, you probably won't finish the race. And so I think that means that with that pace is, how do I hold on to the things that I can't replace and put time and energy and replace the things I need to replace as I can. Now, it may be you've got to do a lot of things urgently over the next little while, but I think it's really important to actually watch that process and maybe in a family, watch each other. One of the sure signs that everyone's getting tired and skinless is irritable, arguments, short tempers, not sleeping because you're not relaxing and you're tensed up. All these, they're not mental illnesses, they're trivial things, but they all combine to actually undermine what's really important, which is the family unit. And just I think the whatever we don't put energy into and time and attention is going to change. So that means really stopping and think about how do we do this, do what we have to do, how do we make a plan to prioritise and to do things steadily. There'll be absolute things that you have to do, but there will be a way of balancing things out, because the way it seems is not often the way it is. We can shift things. Now, if you're in that adrenaline mode, you can't get into the part of your brain that allows you to be strategic, to do forward planning, to be creative and looking at other options. You're in this narrowed state. So I think it's terribly important that around about now people start to try and get out of that state. I think you can do that by taking a bit of time out as soon as you can. Maybe getting away from the area and just not thinking about it for a while, then coming back to it. And thinking about how do we do this in the long term. So I just want to say a couple of things about the experience on the day and trauma, just as a way of finishing off, because what we often find is that normal, healthy people have an ability to put aside a lot of bad experience. Just simply put it aside and get on with life. But if we don't process it, it's just sitting there. And so what we find then is that later on, people are very surprised that just when they start to feel very tired, and that could be around about now when you're coming out of that first state of adrenaline, or it could be 3 to 6 months down the track when you've been working pretty hard for quite a long time, you're starting to feel very tired, people suddenly find that the experiences they had on the day suddenly reappear. But they don't reappear as memories of, oh yeah, I remember that was the day and it was pretty terrible. What happens is people suddenly get, we call it a trigger event, don't we, where it reactivates the experience. And, simple things like a woman coming down the hills behind my town in the middle of winter after Black Saturday for a meeting. She comes around the corner and there's a fog bank across the road. And she runs into the fog bank and she's got to pull over and talk herself down and do some heavy breathing because she's gone into a panic attack, because the fog is like the smoke. And I could give other examples of that, where the trigger is grey stuff, creates this, takes her back to the fear, which shows that the fear is like an undigested bit of experience that's sitting there. A memory is, I remember that I had a feeling. But what we talk about with trauma is re-experiencing. I'm having the experience again. It's been triggered. Now, we know that the best way of processing things and putting them in the past is to talk about them, because it's a pretty simplified way of saying it, but just like the adrenaline puts you in the right side of your brain where you're thinking pictures, those pictures and the emotions that go with it just go into a loop. What breaks the loop is to describe that loop to somebody else, because then you've got to use the left side of your brain. The left side of the brain, whereas we think in words and pictures. When you talk to yourself, say, no, pull yourself together, Rob, it's not that bad, you'll be all right. I say that to myself at 3 o'clock in the morning if I wake up and I'm worried about coming to a place like this and giving a talk. What am I going to say to these guys? Calm down, Rob, think about it, talk to people, you'll know what to say. Right? I've talked myself down, haven't I? But I've got to actually not just go around the loop. And one of the things I think is really important here is to keep the conversation going about your experiences. We know that when people talk about their experiences, they move on from it and put it in the past. When they don't, then they actually just sort of lock it down into place. The problem is that when you talk about it, often you get a rush of feeling, and people get worried about a rush of feeling. But I think we should see that as a good thing, because in psychology we know that feelings that are expressed and obvious are never the problem. If someone gets upset by remembering a sad thing, that's fine, just simply be with them and they'll come through it. What's going to be a problem is shutting down feelings and not having them. And therefore I think there's something you can just focus on that I think is very simple. If a person tells their story, you'll find that when they get to a time where they felt in danger, or it was the most dangerous and difficult time, they will very often stop the story at that point. And they will actually then talk about how it came about, or they'll often go into anger or frustration or fear. And if you just try to understand what happened and you don't follow them into that loop of emotion, you'll find that you're left wondering, well, okay, they thought they were going to die. I wonder why they didn't. And that's not in the story. Do you ever notice that? People tell a story and they leave you at that moment, and you go then into the emotions of that moment. I call that the ad break. You know, like on television, they stop and show the ads at the most exciting point. But I think that shows that the dangerous part is in one loop in our mind. And of course, once you come out of danger, the adrenaline starts to drop. So the person's not connecting it all up. And I think something we can really do for people is to simply say, what happened next? What did you do? And help them tell the whole story, because every time they remember that bit that leads to the danger, they go off into the danger and whatever that leads them to. Instead of going, I thought I was going to die, but I didn't because of this. Whatever the reasons were, there'll be reasons. And that's what keeps resolving it and helps it gradually fade into the past. It's not uncommon for people to think for a moment that they're going to die, and that can be a haunting thing, and people will often keep going back to what might have happened. And I think that's really important, to keep your mind, keep aware of what's going on in your mind, so that if you find yourself worrying about what might have happened, you keep reminding yourself of why it didn't happen, and keep going back to what actually did happen. And that's where having conversations and telling stories, talking together, maybe just making sure that all of the details are sorted out, gives that sort of holistic picture that helps things to start to fade into the past. And, you know, from what people tell me, it takes a long time to actually process that. You can't do it when you're in the adrenaline mode. You start to do it when you start to come out. And, you know, if the people at Black Saturday are any guide, they actually keep telling the story for a few years, because they are changing and different aspects of the story become important. And so we need an environment where you can keep talking about it. Now, the people who are interested to talk about it are the people who went through it. What you find is the people that didn't go through it, that may be your normal friends and relatives, I don't know, in Adelaide or somewhere, they don't get it. After a while they're sick of hearing about it, and they'll start to say things like, you know, well, you should move on, you should think positive and stop talking about it. But actually it does keep coming up, and I think it's a very healthy thing to be able to talk about it and to you know, have a kind of community that can go that journey together. You know, I think you've got a fantastic community here, and the way you know, gathering together and people talking about sporting clubs and the informal meetings around that. It's tremendously important, because it's very clear from all the research that communities that have a good social life and meet together and have a lot of ability to get together and solve problems together recover faster, and they do their economics better because they make better judgments, because they actually get out of that adrenaline mode and they can make better problem solving. And one final thing that goes with that is using all the help that's available. Because if you've ever paid taxes, this is why you paid them, to actually make sure that there were services for you to support you. It's your money actually paying for all this. I think that's the message. Most of us pride ourselves on not using government. We don't want to have anything to do with government, do we? If we can get away with it. But actually this is the time to take back. Yeah, so look, I'll leave it there and see if anyone's got any questions or comments. But I suppose my message is really stop and think about how you're going to do this next year or so, and keep a careful note on the things that you don't want to lose over the next period of time.